So Zay Flowers played for 4 years in the ACC at Boston College. He got 3,000 yards over a space of 4 years. He weighs 182 pounds soaking wet, stands 5 foot 9 inches off the ground, and looks something like an NFL wide receiver if you squint and tilt your head to the right just a little bit. So first off, let's look at Zay Flowers in comparison to his team situation. He is quite frankly the best wide receiver prospect to come from Boston College in forever. Now if I go back before our PFF data window, I can find some players as a wide receiver 1 for that team who get something like his overall receiving yards per team pass attempt as a wide receiver 1, but none of them were drafted into the NFL particularly high, and none of them turned out to be particularly relevant for fantasy. Absolutely no wide receiver coming from that college has anything like his stats. He's very clearly a different type of prospect coming from that place, and he's worthy of attention. For the last 3 years he played for Boston College, he was getting around about a 25 to 26% target share or more. For those last 3 years he was above the age curve in receiving yards per team pass attempt and yards per route run. Let's talk about yards per route run because it's kind of interesting. For the last 3 years he was actually running over 27 routes per game. Actually, for 2 of those seasons, he was running over 30 routes per game and playing over 8 games. So he's heavily used and getting that target share and earning targets at a fairly efficient rate relative to his volume. For most of the time, he's running a relatively low slot rate, but it isn't extreme, isn't in the single digits. He's running the lowest slot rate he ever ran was around 25%. He's mostly running a fairly average slot rate of around 30 to 40% of his routes are ending up in the slot, but he is running a significantly high ADOT in every year apart from his last year in 2022, his ADOT dropped to 10. The 2 years before that, he was running a 14 ADOT or over. He's getting a lot of air under the ball before he receives it for most of the time in college, and then last year his ADOT dropped. That's fairly confusing, so I'm probably just going to put a screenshot up on the screen. I don't know why I feel the need to talk it out. Through that time, he's running around a 2.1 to a 2.2 yards per route run. Some of the things you should know about yards per route run is it's much more situation dependent in that it can be affected by how successful the team is and how successful the players are around him, and also how good his quarterback is, a little bit more than something like receiving yards per team pass attempt. Through those last 3 years, between 2020 and 2022, he's actually getting a slightly above average QB targeted rating, which is a stat I've dug into in PFF a little bit. It does show some signal for the wide receiver and tight end position, but they're not exponentially high. It's not like every time the quarterback targeting Zay Flowers in college suddenly became Patrick Mahomes. He was just slightly better than most players on his, but I don't know how that stat's calculated. PFF doesn't have that on their website necessarily. I think it's just over or under a regular QB rating, and so it's not going to be adjusted for the situation either, and so it's a bit like yards per route run in that it's not situation agnostic. Another way of saying that is I don't know how much that matters. Ultimately, if Zay Flowers' profile has a problem, it's that he's a slightly small receiver running a relatively low slot rate with a relatively high ADOT on average. Although again, that final year it did drop to 10 point something or other. If you compare his numbers to players that go on to do well in the NFL with those kind of slot rates and ADOTs, which is not situation adjusted for, you're just looking at the average of players who ran similar type of slot rates with similar type of ADOTs over 10 or below 20 or over 30. I'll put up a screenshot as well. And his numbers are actually below average for players who go on to do well with that type of role. But again, how much can we adjust those numbers for his situation? Not really at all. Yards per route run and receiving yards per team pass attempt are trying to do a job of adjusting for how much volume and how much situation he was actually accounting for relative to his teammates. And so to adjust it any further, it wanders off into the flowers and tries to tell you what you want to hear. But he's weird, man. I have no other way of saying this, and there's nothing that I can draw from it, so I'm just going to tell you. He averages, especially through those last 3 years, he averages more receiving yards per team pass attempt than he does yards per route run. He's more of the team's overall offense per team pass attempt than he is per his own routes run, and that's just weird. It's not particularly a feature of busts, and it's not particularly a feature of hits. There are 3 players since 2016 that have done that for their average with over the sample size, and that's Kenny Golladay, Calvin Ridley, and Juju Smith-Schuster. But there's also a whole host of other players that have done it. It's a high range. There isn't any correlation here. It's just weird to average more per team pass attempt than per yards run, and I don't know what to do that. I don't know what to do with that. It's just a weird feature. It's weird, okay? And another part of that is if you just remove his first year it disappears. He stops being on that list because his first year he played 13 games but only got 14 routes per game. So his receiving yards per team pass attempt is counting it, but his receiving yards, his yards per route run isn't counting it because he wasn't getting over 15 routes per game. If you just remove it, that stops. And the thing is, I don't know if that's better or worse because there is no signal to that single indicator. It's just something I noticed as a feature of some players' profiles. That's not how that number's meant to work. Zay Flowers looks like a player who fits in a really significant role. The NFL drafts that role at a significant rate. Players that run anywhere from a 20 to a 40% slot rate and an ADOT over 10. The NFL likes drafting those guys. Zay Flowers coming from a team with 0.8% of draft picks in the first 3 rounds coming from it. Boston College is not the host of many successful NFL players, but they do take shots there, and he's getting enough pre-draft buzz, we can expect some level of draft capital coming in. I'm not concerned about his overall size profile or his adjusted athleticism, because I think that's baked into his production, and I'm mostly willing to let other people make those bets. His comps run anywhere from Zach Pascal up to and including Darnell Mooney, and if you believe Travis May from Rojo, Antonio Brown, Deontay Johnson is a fairly significant comparison when you're looking at his role and his age-adjusted production, or just his production in general. There's some decent commonalities to that. Unlike DJ Chark, Zay Flowers was the wide receiver 1 for Boston College for all 3 years, but DJ Chark was also playing in a similar role at a much higher conference with other significant NFL talent, so I'm not sure that holds much weight either. But Zay Flowers also ran for at 3% of the team's rushing attempts over his time in college on average, and that's not nothing either. It's a fairly significant filter, but there aren't many players playing with his slot rate and his ADOT who went into the NFL with that amount of rushing. The obvious comparison would be Deebo Samuel, which production models had trouble with, or mine at least, had trouble with before he went to the NFL as well, and he had over 3% of rushing attempts for his team, obviously, as well in college, and that might be a significant comparison to players that don't score exactly well in models, score mid, but had much higher range of outcomes. But he played an entirely different receiving role than Zay Flowers. Ultimately, his range of outcomes and the way he could be deployed in the NFL is utterly wild. His production profile overall is positive, and his size profile doesn't matter for me. Ultimately, I've ranked him in tier 4 at wide receiver, which for this draft class is a pretty good tier to be in. It's just a tier of players that I really like. Ultimately, I think their production profile is strong, but I have some questions. Most of them, I hope, are going to be answered by the NFL draft, and hopefully we can game-splain his landing spot into a positive situation. But he's weird, man. Let me know what you think. If you're interested, you can check out all the stats I have on him and every player since 2000 in my college database, which is pinned to my Twitter timeline. It's pinned to my Patreon. It is free. It's just a Google sheet. It links you straight to it. You can download it, make a copy, and have a look yourself. And let me know what you think, or just tell me what you think based on your own process, whether you watch or run numbers yourself. Thanks for checking out the video, and I'll see you in the next one.